Have you ever wondered if you might be the only real person, in the sense that you might be the only one having a real experience of anything? Like, how do you know that other people are really having an experience of seeing things or hearing things or feeling anything? Like, how do you know that everyone else aren't just like biological robots, in the sense that like a robot, they do things but without any internal or mental experience? You might just say that it's common sense to know that everyone else has an experience just like you do, but how do you actually know? Like, what evidence do we actually have to say that? Maybe you're the only person having an experience of anything. When I say biological robot, I'm referring to what's more commonly known as a philosophical zombie, which is a term that's used to describe a being that is in all ways indistinguishable from a regular human, but similarly to something like a rock or a robot, doesn't have any mental internal experience. So no qualia or no sentience, nothing. And I'm not talking about someone who's just like an airhead or something who doesn't realize that they're being a bit rude. I'm talking about a being that literally has no experience whatsoever. Think about what it was like before you were born. There wasn't really anything that it was to be like before you were born. And that's actually one way that you can define a philosophical zombie, is that there isn't anything there is to be like one. So if you were to stab a pea zombie, it would feel no pain because it has no mental experience or qualia of pain. The word qualia describes mental experiences or sensations that are subjective. And so a common example of a quail is the experience of seeing red or feeling embarrassment or excitement. Anything sensory is a quail. So to feel the sensation of pain is to feel the qualia of pain. But even though the zombie feels no pain, it would still outwardly act in all the ways as if it did feel pain, and you would have no idea that you actually stabbed a pea zombie. And if you killed a pea zombie, you would still go to jail, but could we ever actually know that what you killed was a pea zombie and not a regular human? What if we were to probe into the mind of a pea zombie with something like an fMRI machine? Could we ever actually know if someone was a pea zombie or not? Could we ever actually know if philosophical zombies actually exist? With functional neuroimaging, scientists can see specific patterns in the human brain that suggest how a person is feeling, what they're experiencing, or what they're even thinking about in the current moment. And they can actually even predict the type of mental activity that someone is doing, like remembering something, or making decisions, or suppressing impulses. In one research paper titled "Decoding Spontaneous Emotional States in the Human Brain," the scientists put test subjects into an fMRI machine and showed them certain emotionally intense movie scenes to induce specific emotional states. They were then able to see the emotions of the subjects by seeing the patterns in their brains that were the result of an emotion, and then identifying those patterns with the emotions that the subjects self-reported feeling in those moments. The researchers suggest that knowing the brain patterns of emotions may help assess emotional status in clinical settings, particularly in individuals incapable of providing self-report of their own emotional experience, which implies that these brain emotion patterns are distinct and precise enough to know the emotional state of people without self-reporting even being necessary. The researchers reasoned that emotional levels should vary across people, so they gave them the CESD test, which measures levels of depression in people, and also the STAIS test, which measures levels of anxiety. They asked the test subjects to do these tests, and then they scanned their brains with fMRI, and they found that the data and the self-reporting were in concordance with each other. And so the people who had high levels of depression and anxiety also had brain patterns that would suggest that they had higher levels of depression and anxiety. There's actually an even crazier research paper though called Neural Decoding of Visual Imagery During Sleep. In this research paper, scientists were able to read the brain patterns of people while they're asleep and reconstruct their dreams into a video that's on YouTube. They scan the subject's brains while showing them movie clips while they're awake, and then they continue to scan their brains while they're asleep. They found that the same brain activity patterns that occur when an awake person is given a stimulus, such as being shown a dog for example, also occur when that same person sees a dog in their dreams. So knowing this, we know that we can at least directly scan someone's brain and see patterns that seem to directly correlate to their mental experiences. So if we were to scan someone's brain and they didn't have these same neuropatterns, then would we have discovered a philosophical zombie? Well, no, actually, because these neuropatterns are still part of the physical nature of a human, and so if a philosophical zombie was missing them, then they would no longer be physically identical to a human, which would then defeat the definition of a philosophical zombie. So maybe we'd be better off looking into some research that was in the direct pursuit of understanding consciousness itself, and where someone may argue that we have already discovered some at least semi-philosophical zombies. The philosophy of consciousness has been around forever, but the scientific study of it began in the 1800s and sped up a lot in the 1990s. But even still, we have very little empirical understanding of what it is or how it works. Like, how do you study something that seemingly extends beyond the physical world and that can't even be directly observed? Even the successful psychologist Stuart Sutherland in 1989 stated, "It is impossible to specify what it is, what it does, or why it evolved. Nothing worth reading has been written on it." Now, despite Sutherland's quote, scientists have actually discovered some pretty spooky but still intriguing discoveries regarding consciousness, particularly in the study of mental disorders, for example, split brain syndrome. In the average human brain, there are processes which are localized to either the left or the right brain hemisphere, such as speech, where all the processes are conducted in the left side, and also sight, where visual input from each eye is processed by the opposite side of the brain. And so that means that visual input from your right eye is processed by the left side of your brain, and visual input from your left eye is processed by the right side of your brain. And luckily for most people, in between the two brain hemispheres exists a part that is called the corpus callosum, which is a thick area that's packed with a bunch of nerve fibers that allows each side of the brain to communicate with each other. And so this means that if you see something but only with your left eye, which means that the information only gets processed by the right side of your brain, the corpus callosum can send that information to your brain's left hemisphere where speech is processed, so then you can actually still talk about what you saw. But there does actually exist a condition that's called callosal syndrome, or otherwise known as split brain syndrome. And so this happens when the corpus callosum is severed to some degree, which is actually often done on purpose to alleviate severe epilepsy. And so what happens to someone when they have callosal syndrome is that the two brain hemispheres can no longer communicate with each other, and so this can actually cause some pretty freaky results. If a person with split brain syndrome sees something but only with their right eye, and you ask them what they saw, they'll still be able to tell you just like anyone else would. But if that same person sees something but only in their left eye, so the visual input gets processed by the right side of their brain, they actually won't be able to tell you what they saw. And that's because the corpus callosum can't actually communicate the visual input from their right side of their brain to the left side, where speech is usually processed, for that person to actually put into words what they saw. But they'll still be able to point at or grab the object. And if they grab the object with their right hand, they'll still be able to talk about it, like how heavy it is or what it feels like. But if they grab it with their left hand, similarly with their eyes, they actually won't be able to talk about it. And so the reasoning for this is actually just the exact same as for your eyes. The stimuli from your left hand is processed by the right brain hemisphere, and stimuli from your right hand is processed by the left hemisphere. But this is where it starts to get a bit existential about consciousness. So in the 1970s at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, there were experiments done on split brain patients. There was one patient who's known only by his initials PS, who had the really uncommon ability to read and write with both of his brain hemispheres, but his ability to speak was still only localized to the left brain hemisphere. And so when he responded in speech, everything that he was saying was coming from his left brain hemisphere, but both of his hemispheres could respond in writing. Unless he gets a written question which is only shown to one eye, in which case only the corresponding side of the brain can respond to that question. When PS was asked the question, "Who are you?" in writing but shown only to his left eye, so only his right brain hemisphere saw the question, he responded by using Scrabble pieces to write out his name, Paul. He wasn't able to respond with speech because his right brain hemisphere doesn't even process speech, and his left brain hemisphere is literally unaware of the question. So this all seems normal enough, but more interestingly, when he was asked the question, "What is your desired occupation?" in writing that was shown only to his left eye, he responded by writing back, "race car driver." But when he was asked the same question verbally, so it was his left brain hemisphere that was responding, he responded with draftsman. And so perhaps we can interpret this as like the first piece of evidence to suggest that two separate minds can exist in the same brain, one in each hemisphere. Something else that's interesting is when they asked PS to stand up, but in writing and only showing it to his right brain hemisphere, he followed their request. But then when he was asked with spoken language why he stood up, he totally fabricated a response saying that he needed to stretch. And so this was his left brain hemisphere trying to rationalize why he stood up while being totally unaware that he was actually asked to do so. Because he doesn't even have a functioning corpus callosum for his right brain to tell his left brain what he had just read. And so this may suggest that people with split brain syndrome have two separate awarenesses of themselves, so one being in each hemisphere, but it's still not very known if people with split brain syndrome have a dual mind or not. In the 1970s at the National Hospital of Neurology and Neurosurgery in London, an experiment was conducted with a neurosurgeon called Lawrence Weinskrantz and a patient who we know as DB. DB had a blind spot in the left side of his visual field caused by brain damage where he wasn't able to see anything. Using what's known as a Goldman perimeter, the neurologist showed DB horizontal or vertical lines, but only in the blind spot of his visual field, and asked him which orientation the lines were in. Naturally, DB said he couldn't see the lines, but when he was asked to just guess anyway, he got the answer correct almost 90% of the time. And so it seems that his mind was still perceiving the lines even though he wasn't conscious of them. Which in a way kind of makes DB a semi-philosophical zombie. His brain still perceived the stimuli accurately, but just without any of the experience of doing so. The only difference is that a zombie wouldn't exclaim that it didn't see the lines because the zombie never had the qualia of seeing to distinguish from the lack of qualia that you get with blindsight perception. This phenomenon is referred to as blindsight, and it occurs not just in humans but in other animals as well, like monkeys. And not only can people detect the orientation of lines without any qualia of them, but they can actually unconsciously detect other things as well, such as the emotional expression of faces. So we could say that people with blind sight could maybe arguably be kind of partial P zombies, but could we ever actually detect a real definitionally accurate P zombie? In fact, earlier we discussed that with fMRI you can see what people are feeling or thinking, but how can we be so sure that those people are really having those supposedly correlated experiences? Does brain activity that suggests the presence of dreams or emotions or other mental experiences necessarily mean that those people are actually having those mental experiences? Maybe everyone else are just the same as robots in the way that they have behaviors and they move around but without any mental experiences, but just like way more complicated and sophisticated and made of biological material. Intuitively you might say that those fMRI scans can prove that someone isn't a philosophical zombie, but maybe the data can't be used to say anything about P zombies in any case. To paraphrase famous cognitive scientist and philosopher David Chalmers, I can talk to you and I can see how you're behaving. I can do a brain scan and find out exactly what's going on in your brain. Yet it seems it could be consistent with all the scientific evidence that you have no consciousness at all. This philosophical phrase said by David Chalmers suggests that neurochemicals or the brain emotion patterns that we just discussed aren't really sufficient to prove that someone is having mental experiences. Maybe if we knew the inner workings of consciousness, we could answer this question. But the problem is that, in fact, nobody has almost any idea how consciousness works at all. Well, that is depending on how you define consciousness, because consciousness is pretty easy to understand and to explain if you see it as simply as just being awake or as asleep, or maybe being aware or unaware of something. Or from a neurobiological perspective, why and how we feel emotions, or why and how we have senses. These are all examples of what would fit into what's known as the easy problems of consciousness. Take vision for example. We can see things because light goes into our eye and lands on the retina, which then in response the photoreceptive cells, which are known simply as cones and rods, they send electrical signals through your optic nerve to the central ganglia in your brain, and then suddenly you get vision. But hang on a second, how do we get from the physical neural signals to the seemingly non-physical experience of seeing? How do we get from something tangible like an electrical signal to this weird sort of intangible thing that doesn't really have size or shape, or that you can't touch or really even look at, and that is totally unlike anything we've ever observed, the thing that we call mental experiences. What is currently scientifically unexplainable is that why inside of my mind and yours and everyone else's that there is any experience at all. Why aren't we just complex assortments of matter that behave according to the laws of physics? And why is it that on a fundamental level there seems to be something more to us in comparison to rocks and robots? Why aren't we just the same as robots who perform tasks but with the complete absence of mental experiences? It's kind of like the question, why is there something rather than nothing, but for consciousness? Why is it that, as Sam Harris would put it, the lights are on at all? This is what's known as the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness is about the subjective experience of being and how it is made and what it is made of. Perhaps it emerges from the complexity of neural connections in the brain, or maybe it's a property of matter like mass, or maybe it could be a universal force like gravity, or perhaps it could be something entirely separate from the physical world entirely. It seems possible that even if you were to completely analyze any creature, even inspecting each individual interaction between every atom, you could still ask the question of, is it conscious? The essence of consciousness might be something non-physical. This line of reasoning leads some philosophers to believe that consciousness can't be explained by the usual methods of science, or that maybe science will fail us. So I know that people with blind sight could kind of be considered partial P-zombies, but could real, definitionally accurate P-zombies really exist? And let's remember that by definition, philosophical zombies have to be completely physically identical to regular humans. But this actually requires quite a bold assumption, that being that consciousness, whatever it may be, can't be entirely a result of whatever physical processes are happening inside the brain. Science really has no good answer for if philosophical zombies could exist or not. And really there will be no answer until a more comprehensive and thorough understanding of consciousness is achieved. But philosophers have done a lot of thinking on this topic. So maybe we should try leaving science behind and see where philosophy could take us. One sort of fun thought experiment that's brought forward by David Chalmers goes like this. Imagine a population of microscopic people want to move into your body and take over all the functions of your brain. Normally what happens in our brain is each individual neuron will receive electrical signals from all the other surrounding neurons, and itself will send out electrical signals for the surrounding neurons to pick up. Now imagine that these tiny people deactivate your brain, and with special cell phones they perform the functions of each individual neuron themselves. So the question is this person still conscious? Does consciousness require neurons to exist? Or does the pure complexity of a system, regardless of what its components are, be it neurons or tiny people with cell phones, suffice for the existence of consciousness? Some people believe that this person with the tiny people in the head would indeed keep their consciousness, and you may call these people functionalists. But most people, including David Chalmers, believe that this person would lose their consciousness. The point of this thought experiment is not to prove that philosophical zombies could actually exist. It is just to highlight that a non-conscious being is simply conceivable at all. And after hearing this, you might be thinking, hang on a second, this scenario is of a being that is not completely identical to a human like a philosophical zombie is supposed to be. Because this person has tiny people in their head. Regular people don't have tiny people in their head. And that's a good point, but then why should it be necessary that replacing a system of tiny people with cell phones to neurons should turn that system from non-conscious to conscious? But now let's explore some of the arguments against philosophical zombies, some of the reasons why people think that they're inconceivable. According to this 2021 survey of 1,800 philosophers from America, Europe, and Australasia, 51% of them believe that we live in a world that is physicalist, that is, that zombies are inconceivable. In a basic sense, under physicalism, mental phenomena are nothing more than just the physical world. Physicalism can also sometimes be referred to as materialism. To the physicalist, mental phenomena are part of the natural world, in the same sense that, say, life and temperature are. These phenomena may not be considered fundamental to a physicalist, but they can be said to be nothing over and above the fundamental physical features that comprise them. Australian philosopher Frank Jackson, regarding this idea, has been quoted saying, "Consciousness and temperature and life, while not appearing in the inventory of physical ingredients, are nothing more than if we put the right ingredients together." Assuming physicalism is true, then this completely rules out any conceivability of philosophical zombies, simply for the fact that a being that is completely physically identical to a regular human has all the same physical components of a regular human. And therefore, if physicalism is correct when it says that consciousness is nothing over and above the physical, the zombie, just like the human, would then also be conscious, which then turns the zombie just into a regular human. Philosophical zombies are just by definition incompatible with physicalism, because a philosophical zombie is just a human but without consciousness. If consciousness is something physical, then we can't remove it without changing the physical structure of the brain, and to do that would make the P-zombie not physically identical to a regular human, which would then just defeat the definition of a philosophical zombie. One rebuttal to the conceivability of philosophical zombies lies within another idea within the philosophy of mind, which is known as functionalism. Functionalism is not concerned with what mental states are made of, but rather just with how they function. In fact, to a functionalist, the sort of substance that mental states are made out of is actually kind of irrelevant to them. To explain this, we can use the analogy of mousetraps and water, because mousetraps are analogous to the functionalist idea of mental states, whereas water is analogous to the physicalist idea of mental states. The stereotypical mousetrap is composed of a wooden platform and a metal bar that strikes the mouse when it's triggered, but there are also many different designs for mousetraps that use different materials like boxes or poisoned, or you could even consider your cat as a mousetrap. And so the mousetrap isn't defined by what it's made out of, but it's defined by the fact that it catches and kills mice, and so it's defined by its function. On the other hand though, water is made out of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, and if you were to remove any of those atoms from the water molecule, you would no longer have water. The function of water is irrelevant to its definition, whereas the substance or the composition of water is its definition. And so how does this all relate to philosophical zombies? Well, it actually kinda doesn't. Since functionalism doesn't make any claims about what the substance of mentality is, it can actually be compatible with philosophical zombies. Since functionalism doesn't make any claims about the substance of the mind, it's compatible with both physicalism and dualism. Dualism, by the way, just being the opposite of physicalism, and so holding the belief that the mind is made of something non-physical or immaterial. So you could believe in dualist functionalism, where philosophical zombies may be conceivable, or you could believe in physicalist functionalism, which actually makes up the majority of functionalists. Functionalism itself doesn't necessarily imply that mental states are physical, but most functionalists believe that the properties of mental states must be physical in nature, which makes them physicalist functionalists. Although the fact that 51% of philosophers already believe in physicalism probably skews the functionalist population a little bit more towards physicalism. Another argument against philosophical zombies makes use of the fact that we can know about or talk about our qualia, qualia being our sensations or our experiences of things. Remembering that the zombie world is completely physically identical to ours, but just without consciousness, this would mean that consciousness is something non-physical, which implies that just by adding this non-physical thing, we could make the zombies conscious. Given that philosophical zombies are exact physical duplicates of regular humans, including in how they behave, this would then have to mean that consciousness has no causal influence over regular human behavior. And because the zombie world narrative implies that consciousness is physically non-causal, so it causes nothing physical to happen, therefore it seems to mean that if the zombie world is conceivable, then so is the controversial idea of epiphenomenalism. And so if that's the case, then anyone who objects to the idea of epiphenomenalism is then also objecting to the idea of philosophical zombies. Briefly, epiphenomenalism is the idea that physical events in the brain can still cause mental events, but those mental events themselves can't cause anything to happen. So they can't cause physical events or even other mental events to occur. This idea is obviously unintuitive because almost all of us would agree that the mental event of feeling happy can so often cause the physical events of smiling or laughing. To quote from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, epiphenomenalism is just not an attractive or desirable theory. Rather, it's a theory of last resort into which people are pushed by the feeling that all the alternatives are even less plausible. Even epiphenomenalists admit that, from the first-person point of view of a thinking and feeling subject, they don't like it. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy has quoted these philosophers as saying, "Epiphenomenalism has had few friends. It has been deemed thoughtless and incoherent, unintelligible, quite impossible to believe." Now, there are arguments for the conceivability of philosophical zombies, even despite epiphenomenalism, but the topic is very difficult and sophisticated, and to be honest, would just make this video too confusing and too long. So it can be argued that if you were to support the zombie idea, then you must also support the very unfavorable idea of epiphenomenalism, and so you must also prove as to how epiphenomenalism can possibly work. The field of philosophy of mind is so vast and difficult, but although the philosophical zombie is a cool and creepy idea, practically no one believes that they're even possible, at least by the laws of our universe. Some philosophers, though, do believe that philosophical zombies are metaphysically possible, meaning that they would be possible if the laws of nature were different in some ways. So maybe philosophical zombies could actually exist way off in another universe where the laws of nature are actually different. But at least for our reality, we can feel at least mostly sure that everyone we see around us aren't philosophical zombies or biological robots. That there are actually real minds and real people inside of all the bodies that you see around you. If you want to read further, I've added all the links to the sources that I used for the research of this video, but I might have accidentally left out some because I just forgot, I guess.